This is Tiana, who is the co-founder and director of Black Eco Bloom, and my name is Louise. I am the fund development and communications coordinator at Green Calgary. Today, we are going to talk about Black History Month, and we want to use this as an opportunity and a platform to highlight various aspects of the Black experience and discuss how it is relevant to our society today. And as an environmental charity, Green Calgary is, we have an opportunity to discuss eco justice, community resilience, and things of that nature. And I thought it would be a great idea to have the team from Black Eco Bloom to come and engage in this discussion, as it is a core part of your mandate. And Black Eco Bloom is an organization that focuses on empowering Black women to be leaders in creating climate solutions to tackle the climate crisis. So yeah, thank you, Tiana, for making the time to be here today and to have this discussion. I really appreciate it. And I've prepared a few questions to guide us through this discussion. And before we get into it, I always like to preface that we're not saying that we're experts in this topic and not saying that we're representative of the entire Black experience, but rather this is about engaging in these topics to figure out the nuances, to discuss the challenges, and hopefully inspire some positive change. So, before we get into it, I'd love to pass it on to you so that you can introduce yourself, a bit about your background, so we can get to know a little bit more about you, and we can get started after that.
Amazing. Thank you, Louise. Hi, I'm Tiana. I am the co-founder and director of Black Eco Bloom. My pronouns are she, her, and I have a background in political science. That's my undergrad from the University of Calgary, and I'm currently doing my MA in geography, and I'm focusing on decolonial relationships to land and Afro-Caribbean resilience and the ways that these ideas connect. I'm really excited to speak with you today about the topic. I think it's interesting to be able to have these kind of conversations during Black History Month and for them to not just be performative. It's for us to kind of talk about things that are a little bit underexplored and be able to kind of share knowledge, share challenges, share experiences. So yeah, I'm excited.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm really excited as well. And we can go ahead and jump right into it. So my first question is, what inspired you and your team to start Black Eco Bloom, and what is the intention behind your organization?
Yeah, so we started Black Eco Bloom, myself and my co-founder, back in 2022. And we started Black Eco Bloom with the intention of curating a space to support Black women and gender diverse individuals to access support and resources and to enable our success in the environmental sector. And so my co-founder and I actually met during an internship prior to starting Black Eco Bloom. And the first time we met was in Scotland at COP26. And so we had a variety of experiences there, but one of the experiences I think that stands out and relates to why we started Black Eco Bloom was that so many places that we went and so many reporters that we talked to came to us and they were like, "Are you guys the only Black youths from Canada here? Like, are you guys the only Black?" And it just kept being repeated over and over again. And of course, we had no way of really knowing exactly whether we were the only Black youths there from Canada, but it was indicative of an experience where we were not connected to other Black youths from Canada if they were there, or if the number was like small, like if there wasn't a lot of representation. And so I think that was one of the key things that started even before we even had the idea of starting Black Eco Bloom, was this lack of being able to find community abroad when we're talking about topics that impact our communities at home, and a lack of being able to feel like we have support in that way. And so I think that experience is also indicative of kind of an erasure, because lack of representation shows that you're not really putting the experiences of everyone forefront, and you're also kind of ignoring the work, the contributions, the knowledge of Black community leaders who have been doing environmental work. And so that was kind of one of the experiences that led to the creation of Black Eco Bloom. We also met a lot of Black community leaders from the States, Black community leaders from the Caribbean, and Black community leaders from Africa. So I feel like that was part of why we kind of felt like we needed to cultivate more of a community around that here. That was kind of like the early beginnings of Black Eco Bloom. But even when I was thinking about this question, I kind of I hesitated to start with that because I know that representation is often used as a way to relegate Black-led environmental nonprofits into the equity sphere and deny them like critical funding for climate action and environmental justice initiatives, because it's kind of seen as being more about representation through like a transparent lens than being about what representation does. And so for Black Eco Bloom, representation is more about world making, being able to see yourself, see your community represented, and being a part of like decision making, versus like when you don't have representation, what is presented to you and what is presented as the norm is often made into reality. So you don't see Black climate leaders, or you don't see Black climate leaders at an event like COP26, so Black climate leaders don't exist. And so that's like a very simplified version of it, but it's been used to erase our contributions to environmental and climate justice. And it's not just about environmental and climate justice, it's also like the contributions of Black scientists, the contributions of Black theorists, the contributions of Black activists. And so representation is really at the heart of that. And so that's part of what BEB's intention is to dismantle this systemic underrepresentation of Black climate and environmental leaders, professionals, knowledge holders that kind of is permeated in this kind of white environmental and climate spaces in Canada. Yeah.
That's awesome. Wow, that gets me thinking too, because one thing that you mentioned is the current spaces that are already created for Black representation. You recognize the restrictions that are actually involved in that and how it doesn't really do the people that they're trying to represent justice.
Mhm.
And I really commend the idea of not waiting for that space to open up, but rather creating a new space. And I think the ultimate statement of empowerment of instead of waiting for a seat to be made at the table for yourself, creating a whole new table altogether. And I think that I see that as a spirit of what this is, and I think that is really, really awesome. So yeah, that's great. Um, Moving on to the second question is, have you faced any unique challenges while starting Black Eco Bloom, or have you faced any challenges as a Black individual in this space?
Yeah, so I'll start with like the experience of being trying to create Black Eco Bloom. And I think one of the main challenges is underfunding. And so a lot of the times in the beginning when we were trying to receive funding for our activities, and I can also like preface this and understand that like we're still new, we're still figuring out what we want and those kinds of things, what we want to do, what we want our presence to be. But sometimes we're met with kind of a lack of being able to understand where we belong in the space. And so it's this idea that the work that we're doing is not climate focused enough, it's not environmental focused enough, it's too advocacy focused, it's too equity focused, it's not technocratic, it's not policy. And so it's kind of like a lack of understanding how our communities understand and organize around systemic problems. And so I think that is a huge barrier to receiving funding, which would allow us to pay our staff, to pay our volunteer, not really our volunteers, but like to pay our speakers, to pay workshop facilitators, to pay mentors. And so that's really a really big structural challenge that we face. But there are organizations that do understand and support us, which is really amazing, and more so now as the environmental sector is changing. But I'm just excited for there to be more opportunities for an understanding of what climate action is, or an understanding of what environmental action is, or an understanding of what community preparedness is, or community adaptation is, to be able to be molded by our communities for our communities, so that there is that basis of understanding of how we organize and how we understand systemic issues related to climate. So that's the one area. I think also as an individual, I find that there is a huge lack of support for Black women community leaders. And so there's this perpetual burnout, this perpetual being underpaid, perpetual under recognition for our contributions to the social good, to the environmental good. And so, of course, this is still tied to like the issue of structural funding, But even just finding mentorship or seeking advice and those kinds of things, there's a lot of barriers to that. And it's something that I experienced early on when I started Black Eco Bloom, and what I experienced going through the environmental sector. I found it very difficult to navigate, and I found it very difficult to find mentorship and advice, which is also something we're trying to address through Black Eco Bloom, is being able to provide those supports and to be able to provide mentorship. What else? I think there's also kind of like, this is like a nonprofit issue, I guess, in general, in the environmental sector and elsewhere, is not being able to provide funding for community, like for people that are contributing, this unique lens of unique, like diverse experience. And so I'm trying to ensure that there's always some kind of like compensation or honorarium built into our engagements with community. Just because like we're a small nonprofit and we're Black women led doesn't mean that we can't be extractive. And so we do want to be able to give back to our community in that way as well. Yeah.
That is awesome and very insightful. And that I think that's interesting how that space is not going back again to the structure of things, that space is not already there, where you have to choose, are you environment focused, are you focused on climate, or are you focused on more justice and maybe racial justice specifically, and there's no specific understanding for that intersectionality between the two. um, and I agree that there definitely has been more progress within that, and there's been more understanding that it's not black and white in a sense, no pun intended. But I think I'm also seeing this theme that you've experienced these challenges of not being seen in your entirety of what you're trying to do, and then also the lack of support. And now that you are in this position and you started, you want to rectify those and be that support for other organizations within the space that you're interacting with. And there seems to be a level of awareness that even though you are trying to, you're essentially wanting to solve certain issues, you can also still contribute to the problem if you're not careful and not aware. And I think that is extremely, extremely important aspect of, especially in the nonprofit sector, that we need to be careful of. Also working in the nonprofit sector, I think that it's so important when we're seeking to support, seeking to help, knowing that just because you have the intention of helping doesn't mean you are immune to also being part of the issue. And I think that the fact that you and your organization have that level of awareness is really encouraging and is something that we can all take from. So that's amazing.
Yeah, I actually want to
Um,
add a little bit onto that, if that's okay. I think like you said something that reminded me about not being always able to fit into a box. And so, as a systems thinker, I'm always trying to think of the big picture and how all these little pieces fit together. And that's kind of like my brand of environmentalism. And so, for me, that's grounded in relationality rather than kind of like the typical impact. And so, that has kind of been a challenge as well. This idea of how do we measure impact, and through the nonprofit world, that's measured in a very specific way. And it's measured in a way where numbers correlate impact, and impact correlates the amount of funding that you can have. And so, because I'm thinking relationally, for example, me bringing one of our staff members, who's also a Black woman, to New York Climate Week, and that being their first environmental international conference is like a huge win for me. And I'm thinking like, wow, it's amazing that we're able to do this. And I'm thinking back to my first international conference that was possible because a Black-led organization allowed me to go, and now I'm able to pay that forward. For me, that's like a huge impact. But it doesn't always translate as well because it's one person to a climate conference versus 10, you know what I mean? And so that's kind of been a challenge. I don't know if it's like an organization-wide challenge or kind of a challenge just as the way that my brain works, but I think relationality, which in a lot of my research I'm finding is very foundational to Caribbean cultural tradition, it doesn't always translate well into Western Canadian understanding of impact. And so I'm trying to find ways where I don't lose the importance of relationality, but I'm able to kind of translate it better, but also not in a way where I have to change who we are in order to fit into their boxes. And so that's definitely a challenge.
That's very insightful, and I'm aggressively nodding my head because I personally also experienced this even working in Green Calgary when trying to apply for grants, trying to find funding for specific programming, because a lot of our work is centered on education. And education doesn't, you don't see the quantitative results right away. And that's why I really resonate with that whole aspect of relationships versus the numbers. Especially, for example, our Green Kids program, where trying to instill environmental stewardship in youth at a young age, create that foundation. And where we will really see the fruits of that labor is once they become adults and become more active social agents in society. But you can't really put that in a grant application, especially when you are competing against other other applications that are more that fit that mold better. Maybe there's a specific facility or specific technology that's going to create that's going to be easy to track those quantitative metrics and make the organization look really good in a way. So yes, and I think you're also pointing to how that's also an issue among organizations that have mandates like yours, which is about relate that relationship aspect of building that relationship of empowering the individual. So that's, I think, a really great context to put it in. So, and I think it also helps people feel that, oh, this is not just a me issue, this is a structural issue. And it is the issue of trying to fit a circle into a square hole a little bit. And it's more complicated than that, but that's a big aspect of it. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. So yeah, that's awesome. Great. All right. So going into the next question is, how would you describe how the intersectionality between Black identity, Black history, culture, and the issues we see with in the environment and in the current climate crisis?
I think this is a really good question. It's a big question, and I thought a lot about it actually. Um, and so, fortunately, and in some ways, unfortunately, our history as Black people is always intertwined with questions of land and space, and not always in like the labor framing or the enforced labor framing that is very popularized. It's also through refuge, it's through hiding, it's through peace, it's through joy, it's through community. And I don't want to like over essentialize Blackness or paint it as a monolith. Like our experiences vary across the diaspora. But that also echoes why representation is so important. But I've been researching a lot about land dispossession, land rights, and Afro-Caribbean sovereignty and resilience. And I think that that's like embodies your question very well. When you think about the context of descendants of enslaved people, specifically in the Caribbean, there's this constant struggle to legitimize a claim to a place and assert a sense of ownership over it. And I don't mean ownership in the sense that like private property. I mean ownership in the sense that being able to impact what happens to the land. And that's a constant struggle. And so when you don't have that sense of autonomy over your land, and this is a feeling and experience that is echoed across the Black diaspora, you are often pushed into the periphery. And it's not always the periphery geographically, like it's not like always the outskirts of a city or a town. It's also the periphery in terms of accessing resources and decision making. And so these communities are often turned vulnerable or their vulnerability exacerbated by this peripheralization. And so I think that's kind of like at the intersectionality of, Blackness, history, culture, space, because this peripheralization impacts the ways that we interact with each other and the ways that we interact with the land. More locally, I would say you could think about the disparities of how our city is set up in terms of racialization. So, for example, in the Northeast, in Northeast Calgary, there is a number of environmental inequities. And we did a workshop in environmental equities and inequities, and we highlighted the lack of tree canopy access to green space. There's a lot of major roadways, there's industrial areas, and this is a place where a lot of racialized and newcomers live. And so in addition to that, there's also the YYZ International Airport. And in our workshop, we highlighted research that we did on finding the responses of individuals in that community and how they are coping with and experiencing living close to the airport. And so one of the things that was highlighted is that they get a lot of headaches, and that impacts their sleep patterns. But most notably is the very strong, very, very strong. I'm from the Northeast. I grew up in the Northeast. There is a very strong rotten egg smell that covers the entire Northeast area around spring, summertime. And that smell is from a combination of stormwater ponds near the airport and de-icing fluid from de-icing the planes. And so this is always responded to by saying that there is no health risk to this smell. There's no health risk to living near the airport. But this denies a communal and holistic understanding of community wellness. And so by ignoring the anecdotal reactions of community members, you are ignoring that there are other aspects to environmental health other than just these very clear understandings of environmental risk, if that makes sense. It also perpetuates this stigma about the Northeast that has been used to perpetuate further discrimination, isolation of individuals who live in specific areas. And so these are the kinds of things that I think you don't get when you don't experience intersectional environmentalism, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answered your question. That was long.
No, that definitely did answer my question, and I think it's very helpful how you pointed to different examples within Calgary and within the local context. I think, especially with the example of the Northeast, I think it speaks to how you cannot deny that there's the correlation between racialization and access to environmental tools and resources. Um, and me coming here as an immigrant, for example, and learning, you also kind of see that, oh, there is some, segregation of where do the newcomers tend to go. And that's not by happenstance. And I think you also pointed to if there is this correlation between these two aspects of racialized communities and access to environmental resources, and how that is then affecting the health of the communities, and then how then that also perpetuates an idea and a stereotype of how these communities are. It's, I think, showing a bit of a cycle, of a negative cycle that's going on, because, and I think that's eye-opening for me as well, because I mainly was seeing it as a correlation where it's okay, yes, certain people are facing these specific issues, and there's a correlation between ethnic identity and the issues that they're facing. But then it's more of a circular effect, because that is then leading to a specific effect on their community health, and then their identity, and then which leads to further stereotyping, which has other effects. So yeah, I think that that's very insightful, and a good thing to, when we're talking about how do we break these barriers, it's also figuring out what are the negative externalities that have happened because these barriers have been put in place, and not seeing it more as a linear thing. And the aspect of the rotten egg smell is wild. And even the stories of people who have said that they experience headaches and things like that. I think we've definitely seen a lot of stories like that of people who've lived near a specific, whether it's like a specific extractive zone, and they're experiencing health risks, and looking at, is there a pattern to what kind of people are put in or are placed in those areas. So yeah, and it's eye-opening to see that that is happening in Calgary, and it's eye-opening for me, and I don't think it's something that everyone knows. So it's really important, I think, to have these sorts of conversations and have that awareness, and the anecdotal aspect of it too. Hearing people's stories is really important. It's hard to quantify that whole, egg smell, or this is happening, but then these are stories of individuals and of people who haven't been given that platform to speak yet. So yeah, and that's awesome that you've been able to engage in that research and work with those communities. So yeah, that's really awesome. Um, Yeah, and I'll dive into the next question, which is what lessons can we learn from Black communities to address today's environmental challenges and representation when it comes to environmental decision making?
Mhm. Um, I think so. I was like on the fence about like the term lessons, and so I'm not sure about lessons, but I would say like maybe we need other communities and other people to work with us. So in order for us to work together, you need to include us in decision-making processes. You need to include us in funding opportunities. You need to include us in mentorship and networking opportunities and really go the extra mile to ensure that we're engaged and participating. It can't just be about the representation of a Black body in a space. It has to be about feeling comfortable enough to participate, feeling comfortable enough to share our experiences, feeling comfortable enough to share our ideas and our solutions. Um, because there is a white problem in environmentalism in Canada, and it doesn't lend itself to more radical and decolonial solutions to climate and environmental challenges. And so I think I do want to deviate from the learning lessons from our community, and because it can be passive and it can be extractive. And I think that it can start with like a community conversation and end with a community conversation, or it can start with a panel and end with a panel. And so I think that the work that needs to be done is about changing how you interact with our communities and framing that interaction through relationality. And how can a relationship with organizations like Black Eco Bloom not only benefit us fiscally, structurally, but how can it further create avenues for collaboration and change making? So, what is the actual impact to the challenge that we're trying to solve? That kind of thing. So, I do think it should go a step further and move beyond that kind of passive and extractive kind of partnership or relationship or dynamic.
Hey, that makes sense what you just said, and that is very helpful too, because I have been using this term quite a lot. And when you say it like that, it makes sense because if I'm to summarize what you're saying, this question is extractive in the sense of what can I learn from the experience and particularly negative experiences that you've had, take from that and make my experience better.
Mhm.
And that does not solve the issue. Again, it is extractive because I'm taking what you have to offer, applying it to the current space that we're in without changing that space. And what people of color, Black people are asking is the space itself needs to change. And in order for that space to change constructively and not performatively, but actually, is don't ask about getting lessons from me, but rather include me in a genuine partnership and let's be side by side rather than a teacher student dynamic.
Mhm.
And I really like how you said that. And I think it it's important then moving forward to structure these sort of conversations and be aware of how we're even structuring these sort of conversations. Um, and that actually makes me think of the feedback structures that we put in place as nonprofit organizations to get feedback from the people who we're working with. So whether it's immigrant communities or people in a specific area or from a specific minority group or equity deserving group, we might host a workshop, we might do a specific program with them, and then at the end, we'll send them a survey and say, how did you experience this? What did you learn? What can we do better? And that is a good starting point. But then if I'm to apply what you just said, in order to really engage them at a more impactful level, it's how can I engage you in the decision making aspect of what you want for your community?
Mhm.
And how do I bring you into the table rather than extracting the information from you, taking it back, and still keeping you out the door? It's again, and also speaking to how do you get comfortable enough to come into that space. And I think comfortability is a very important aspect of things too. You can ask for feedback, but then have you created a safe space for that feedback to be given? Um, and have you created a space for people to speak at a more intimate level than just checking the box of yes or no? So the
Mhm.
aspect of comfortability too is very, very important, and something that it can't be, it's not something that you can compute and say, if we do A, B, and C, comfortability check. It's a relational thing.
Mhm.
And I think that's also another aspect of how important organizations like Black Eco Bloom are, because you focus on the relationship. Um, so yeah, I think that that's really awesome. And thank you for educating me on that. That was really cool.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
we're learning together. And I think like what you said about comfortability is really, really important. And one of our programs that we're designing, our climate leadership program, it is very specifically designed so that our fellows leave feeling like they have the skills, knowledge, and confidence to be able to go into spaces and say, I am showing up here as a leader and I feel comfortable being able to tell you my knowledge and I feel comfortable being able to tell you my solutions and how we can make this space better. When I say make this space better, I don't mean like the job of remaking the space so that it's like decolonial or no longer like rooted in white supremacy. I just mean like being able to contribute to these places like climate adaptation and climate action and environmental justice and feeling comfortable to do that. I think the confidence aspect and the comfortability, like you said, it can't be computed. It has to be built brick by brick. And so, yeah, it really is rooted in relationality. And I think that you recommunicated that to me in a way that I didn't even realize how so I even learned back what you said to me.
That's awesome. And I think that's the essence of why we have these conversations. So yeah, that's great. And then on to the next question is, what advice would you give to Black individuals who want to get into this sort of environmental advocacy and sustainability space? Or even we can expand that to an individual who sees that there's a lack of representation of a particular issue or particular part of the identity that they want to see more and want to start something. What advice would you give to them?
Join us. Hello, come join us. But no, I think, well, first of all, we have a series on our Instagram where we asked Black women environmentalists to provide some advice, so they should definitely check that out. But I think my advice would be to explore, see what fits you, and find community where that is. I don't think that there is like one way or like one roadmap. When I started, I don't even know why I believed this, but I believed that there was like a way to do it. And so there is not one way, and you really have to find what works for you. And seek out a mentor. Like I wish I found a mentor really early on, and I wish that I had someone to bounce ideas off of and ask questions to, and for someone to share their challenges and the ways that they overcame those challenges. So definitely seek out a mentor. And don't feel like you have to conform to the environmental spaces as they are. Seek out spaces that are doing things differently, and work with community to create those spaces. In my experience, I found a lot of community with Black women from the States and Black women from the Caribbean who do environmental and climate justice work. I learned a lot from them, and I learned how how important it is to be based in community when you're trying to do this work. And so those are places you can go. It doesn't have to be just in your own home because, like as Black people, we're part of a diaspora, we're part of a global community, and there's always beauty in being able to connect and share our experiences. What else? But there's also a lot of like Black-led and youth-led organizations here that do amazing work, and you can connect with them and don't be afraid to ask questions and make connections, volunteer. And I guess lastly, I would say like, yeah, find those gaps that you feel like you're not represented in, and either find people that also feel the same way so that you can build community around it, or find people who want to create that space with you because it's not easy or really that possible to do it alone. And it's better to do it with community. And like for me now that I've gone through this, I would love to see more space being made for Black women who are more introverted, who maybe like learn and build community differently than like a traditional like leader. A lot of leadership programs look for people that are very like vocal and extroverted, but there's a space for all of us. And so as things like change and grow and open, there's so much more to be done, and there's so much space for so many different kinds of people that I think like you just have to find your spot. Yeah.
That's awesome. And some of the things that I'm hearing is, first of all, just get started. And the first thing is to find your community, and your community is not restricted to your physical location, especially in this day and age where we're very globally connected, and you can find people who share your experiences but live on a different continent, or live in a different country, or live in a different province. And I would say maybe one thing to um, add as well. And this is just a general project management advice, which is have a clear goal in mind, or at least have direct intentionality in what you're trying to do. I think it's especially important when we're talking about representation and filling the gap. Sometimes a gap can exist, and we might want to fill it, but why? Are we filling it for the sake of it being filled? If that is the case, then we can run into the issue of the performative um, actions, or the passive sort of actions that don't really lead to meaningful change. But when we look at, here's the gap, I want to fill it, and this is why I want to do it, and this is the goal in mind because it's going to add value to the community in this way, I think is a great frame of mind to also put in there. Um, but yeah, I think that it's really great what Black Eco Bloom is doing in creating that community, bringing people together. And it seems that you are still looking for where are those gaps that are still need to be filled. And I think that is really amazing. You mentioned the different projects that you guys are doing. Is there any other plugs that you want to put for anyone who is watching this and wants to get more involved? First of all, how can they reach out to you? And also, what are some specific projects that you guys are really excited about and are looking for people to join?
Yes, I actually meant to talk about some of this earlier, but um, I will start with saying our programming is organized through the three C's of change. And so that's community connections, community climate preparation, and community training. And so in our community training pillar, in the past, we've had like our eco leaders modules. So we're talking about ways to get involved in the environmental sector. Our eco leaders modules are great for that. And it really speaks to the EB's intention to be a space for learning and exploring. We have introductory modules on climate change, on climate mitigation and adaptation, food security, energy and just transition, like very like introductory information that can help you figure out what you're passionate about. We talk about community land trust. We talk about community activism. We talk about various things, and each module has a case study that kind of like applies the information from the modules. And so previously that was only available through our eco leaders training program, but we're hoping to make it more accessible and still continue with that learning. So stay tuned for that piece. And then for community climate preparation, we have our climate leadership program, which I'm very excited about. The applications and the information will be launched soon on our social media. The best way to stay in touch with us and to understand what we're doing is through our Instagram and LinkedIn. And you can also sign up for our newsletter, which will send out information that way. But the Climate Leadership Program is a kind of like a fellowship that's based in Calgary through a partnership with the City of Calgary. And with this program, you're able to gain sector-specific knowledge on local climate adaptation, and you will receive access to a mentor, access to funding, to complete a project or an initiative of some kind that relates to climate change, and being able to either raise awareness on the impacts of climate change or create some kind of local micro level impact on adaptation in the community. And so it's a really cool project that we're designing, and I'm really excited about it. And then last but not least, through community connections, we're always looking for opportunities to connect with everyone and to bring people together. And so we, throughout the years, have hosted community conversations. We typically do our in-person activities in Calgary, but we're hoping to change that through our Roots of Wisdom research project, which is kind of like a love letter to our ancestry, to diasporic sustainability knowledge and that kind of thing. We'll be having community conversations where we get to hear from elders, from younger people, from each other on the ways that African Indigenous sustainability knowledge has been preserved and translated through the generations. And so that's another thing that we have coming up that you can get involved in. So yeah.
That's amazing. There are a lot of great initiatives that are available, and it's exciting to hear that all the work that you guys are doing, and the fact that nobody told you to do this, but it was really a genuine passion and initiative that you and your team started, and it's still going strong. And I think that's something that I think you should definitely be proud of yourselves about. And I'm also very proud of you guys. So thank you again for taking the time to have this very fruitful and meaningful conversation. And happy Black History Month, first of all. And yes, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what Black Eco Bloom has in store for us. There's obviously a lot of great things that are happening, and how you're going to be supporting and helping different community groups as well. So yeah, I'll end off our conversation here, and I look forward to staying connected.
Yay! Thank you so much, Louise, for this conversation. Very much needed.
Absolutely.